The investigation. The night after Samuel's sharp rebuke was restless for Dorian. He lay in the massive four-poster bed of his childhood room, staring at the carved ceiling beams, the shadows shifting with the flicker of the fireplace. He had not slept in this room in over a decade, and the air felt thick with memory. His father's voice echoed in his skull, words spoken with trembling lips but burning clarity. Weakness is arrogance. You accuse the very person who has stood by me when no one else would. He had spent his life ignoring voices that tried to tame him. Rivals in boardrooms, critics in the press, even estranged family had tried to pierce his armor. None had succeeded. But this voice, the voice of the man who had once been his anchor, lodged itself deep within him, creating an unease he could not shake. His thoughts turned again and again to Maya. The way she had stood unflinching when he accused her. The way she had spoken without apology in the dining hall. The way his father's frail hand had reached for hers with unspoken trust. Each image gnawed at him. His instincts screamed to dismiss it all as manipulation, a carefully crafted act. Yet his gut, sharpened over years of negotiations, told him something was off. Not with her, but with his assumptions. By morning, his restlessness hardened into resolve. If Maya was not what she seemed, he would find proof. If she was sincere, then perhaps, though the thought unsettled him, he owed her an apology. Either way, he needed the truth. Dorian began with Harris, the butler who had served the Kane household longer than Dorian had been alive. He found the man in the library, polishing the already gleaming brass handles of a cabinet. "Harris?" Dorian said. His tone clipped, the way he spoke to subordinates in his empire. "I want to know everything about Maya Williams. Where she came from, what she's done, who she's connected to." Harris hesitated, his cloth pausing mid-polish. His lined face remained neutral, but his eyes flickered with something unspoken. "She has been with us for over a year, sir. She came from the coastal town of Brookhaven, seeking employment after her mother fell ill. Her references were solid. She worked in 2 households before ours, both of which spoke highly of her. She has no known family in this city, though she sends part of her wages back home regularly." Dorian narrowed his eyes. "And what of her character? What do the staff say when I am not listening?" Harris folded the cloth carefully, placing it aside before answering. "They say she is diligent, patient, tireless in her care for your father. Some envy her closeness to him. Others distrust what they do not understand. But I have seen with my own eyes, sir. Her devotion is not a performance." The certainty in Harris's voice struck Dorian like an unwelcome truth. Still, suspicion clung to him. "Even the best masks slip eventually," he muttered. "I will find out what she is hiding." Harris bowed slightly. "Perhaps, sir. But sometimes the truth is not hidden. Sometimes it is simply overlooked." The words lingered in Dorian's mind long after he left the library. His next step was subtle observation. For the first time since his return, Dorian began to notice details he had dismissed before. From his study, he watched as Maya guided his father through gentle stretches, speaking in a calm voice that soothed rather than patronized. He saw the way she anticipated Samuel's needs before he voiced them, bringing a blanket when his hands trembled, adjusting a lamp when his eyes strained. He noticed how she endured the whispers of the other staff without flinching, carrying trays, folding linens, and scrubbing floors with the same diligence she showed in caring for his father. What unsettled him most was her solitude. She did not seek companionship among the servants, nor did she attempt to curry favor with him despite the tension between them. She moved through the house like a quiet force, steady and self-contained. Her worth derived not from what others thought of her, but from her own unshakable sense of duty. One afternoon, he overheard a conversation between 2 maids in the corridor. They whispered about how Maya had spent her own meager wages to buy Samuel a particular herbal tea, when the doctor's prescriptions failed to soothe his restless nights. Another time, the cook mentioned how Maya had skipped her own meals to stay at Samuel's side during one of his more difficult evenings. Dorian listened. Each account another stone laid upon the fragile bridge forming in his mind between suspicion and reluctant admiration. But it was not enough. He needed facts, not stories, and so he made inquiries beyond the estate. Using contacts in the city, he sent for reports on Maya's past, her employment records, her family background, her financial dealings. Within days, a thick envelope arrived on his desk. He poured a drink, sat in the leather chair of his father's study and tore it open. The contents surprised him. The reports confirmed Harris's words. Maya had left school at 16 after her father's death in a dock accident. She had worked tirelessly since, supporting her family, sending money home each month. Her employers had praised her reliability, honesty, and resilience. There was no sign of deceit, no hidden connections, no evidence of manipulation. She had debts, yes, but only those born of poverty and sacrifice, not greed. Among the documents was a letter of recommendation from a previous mistress of a household. The words leapt from the page. Maya Williams is not merely a maid. She is a person of uncommon character, whose loyalty and compassion extend far beyond the call of duty. To entrust her with one's home is to entrust it with dignity itself. Dorian sat back, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. He was not a man easily moved, yet he felt something shift inside him, a crack widening in the wall of cynicism he had built. If this was true, if Maya's devotion was not an act but a reflection of who she was, then what did that make him? A man who had misjudged, who had wronged her, who had turned her dignity into shame. The thought gnawed at him. That evening, he found himself wandering the halls, drawn by the faint sound of music. Following it, he came upon the veranda, where Maya sat beside Samuel, humming softly as she mended a torn sleeve of one of Samuel's nightshirts. Samuel's eyes were closed, his face peaceful as he listened. Dorian lingered in the shadows, unseen. He studied her. Her steady hands, her calm expression, the way her presence filled the space with quiet strength. For the first time, he did not see a maid or a potential manipulator or a threat. He saw a woman carrying burdens few could bear with such grace, and he saw his father at peace. Because of her. The realization unsettled him more than suspicion ever had. The following day, Dorian confronted her, not with rage this time, but with the sharp curiosity of a man who needed answers. He found her in the garden, tending to a patch of herbs Samuel had insisted on planting despite his frailty. "Why do you do it?" he asked abruptly, his voice low but edged with demand. Maya looked up, startled but composed. "Do what, Mr. Kane?" "Stay, care, endure. You could find easier work elsewhere. Why remain in a house where you are accused, distrusted, and mistreated?" His eyes searched hers as though daring her to lie. She set down the watering can, her gaze steady. "Because your father matters. Because every human being, no matter how frail, deserves dignity. And because I made a promise, to myself, to the memory of my father, that I would never turn away from someone who needed me. Not while I had the strength to stand." Her words struck him like a blow. There was no hesitation, no trace of falsehood. Only truth, simple and unadorned. Dorian swallowed hard, his pride warring with something deeper. He wanted to challenge her, to dismiss her words as naive. But the longer he looked into her eyes, the harder it became to deny that he believed her. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. Not about her, but about himself. That night, Dorian stood once again on the veranda, the sea roaring below. He thought of the path his life had taken. Walls built from suspicion, bridges burned in pursuit of power, a heart hardened against vulnerability. And now here was a maid, dismantling those walls with nothing more than truth and quiet strength. His father's voice echoed again. "Perhaps you need to remember who you were meant to be." For the first time, Dorian wondered if he was ready to try. The redemption. The Kane estate had always been a house of echoes. Echoes of footsteps across marble floors. Echoes of laughter from a past long buried. Echoes of silence that followed arguments never resolved. For Dorian, returning to this place had felt like stepping back into a cage he had long since escaped. Yet as days slipped into weeks, he found himself listening differently. The walls no longer whispered just of the past. They now reflected back at him the man he had become, and the uncomfortable truth of what he had lost. Samuel's rebuke had pierced him, but it was the quiet dignity of Maya that haunted him most. Every time he saw her, whether she was carrying linens through the hall, kneeling by Samuel's chair, or silently enduring the suspicious glances of the other staff, he felt something stir inside him. It was not attraction, though he could not deny she possessed a quiet beauty. It was something deeper, something far more disarming. It was the realization that she was everything he was not. Patient, humble, resilient, unshaken by pride, and that realization gnawed at him. One evening, As the sun sank low and painted the horizon with streaks of gold and crimson, Dorian found himself lingering outside his father's chamber. The door was slightly ajar, and through it he saw Maya seated beside Samuel's bed reading softly from a book. Samuel's eyes were closed, a faint smile tugging at his lips, his frail hand resting atop hers. For reasons he could not explain, Dorian did not announce himself. He simply stood there watching. He thought of how he had accused her, how he had shoved her, how he had humiliated her in front of the household. Shame pressed against his chest like a weight he had never carried before. In the world he inhabited, the world of ruthless deals and merciless power, apologies were rare, unnecessary, even dangerous. But here in this house with this woman and this dying man, he felt the old rules crumbling. Later that night, unable to sleep, Dorian poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the study. The reports he had gathered about Maya still lay on the desk, her history written in black and white. Sacrifice, struggle, resilience. He traced the words with his eyes, feeling a hollow ache that numbers and profits had never stirred in him. He thought of the years he had spent building walls, distancing himself from anything that might demand vulnerability. And he realized with a pang he could not shake, that in protecting himself from pain, he had also walled himself off from humanity. The next morning, he made a decision. He found Maya in the garden again, her hands dusted with soil as she tended to the herbs Samuel loved. She looked up at him warily, expecting another confrontation. Instead, Dorian stood in silence for a moment, then said something that surprised even himself. "I was wrong." The words felt foreign on his tongue, heavy and awkward. He had not spoken them in years, not in boardrooms, not in relationships, not even in arguments where he knew he had lost. But now, before this woman who had no power over him, he forced himself to say them again. "I was wrong. About you. About what I saw. About what I accused." His voice was rough, edged with the discomfort of pride being dismantled. "I judged without knowing. I lashed out because it was easier than admitting I didn't understand. And for that, I'm sorry." Maya studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. She saw the tension in his jaw, the reluctance still clinging to him, but she also saw sincerity, clumsy, hesitant, but real. "Apologies," she said quietly, "are not for the one who speaks them. They are for the one who receives them. And forgiveness is not a debt owed, it is a choice." He swallowed, nodding slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness, I only want you to know that I see you differently now." Her expression softened, though she did not let him off easily. "Words are fragile, Mr. Kane. They can be spoken and forgotten in the same breath. Actions endure." The challenge in her tone unsettled him, but he found himself strangely grateful for it. She did not fawn, she did not appease, she demanded substance. And for perhaps the first time in years, he wanted to prove himself to someone not through wealth or power, but through change. That change began quietly. Dorian started spending more time with his father, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to bridge the distance between them. He joined Samuel and Maya on the veranda, listening as Samuel spoke of the sea, of memories long past, of lessons buried under years of estrangement. At first he said little, his pride still clinging to silence. But slowly he began to ask questions, to share fragments of his own life, to reveal pieces of himself he had long hidden. Samuel, though weary, welcomed it with a warmth that melted years of frost. He spoke to Dorian not as a billionaire or a wayward son, but as the boy he once taught to ride horses, as the young man he once hoped would carry more than just the family name. And through it all, Maya remained at Samuel's side, her presence a quiet anchor. She did not intrude, nor did she step aside. She simply existed in the space between father and son, offering the steady reminder that care, patience, and dignity were not signs of weakness but of strength. One afternoon, while Samuel rested, Dorian approached Maya again. This time his words were less an apology and more a confession. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know how to undo the years. I left this house behind because I thought success would fill the emptiness. But the higher I climbed, the emptier it became. And now I stand here, with my father fading, with you looking at me as though I am nothing more than a prideful fool. And I don't know where to begin." Maya regarded him silently, her gaze steady but not unkind. Beginnings are not always grand, Mr. Kane. Sometimes they are as small as sitting beside someone who is lonely, as simple as listening when you would rather speak. Redemption is not about erasing the past. It is about choosing differently in the present. Her words struck him harder than any lecture or sermon ever could. They were not polished or dramatic. They were simple truths, spoken by someone who had lived them. For the first time, Dorian allowed himself to consider that redemption was not a destination, but a journey, and one that required humility more than power. The days grew into a rhythm. Dorian walked with Samuel when his legs allowed it, supporting him carefully. He listened to Maya's advice on his father's care, even when his pride bristled. He began to acknowledge the servants not as faceless staff but as people with lives beyond the walls of the estate. It was awkward, clumsy, and at times insincere in execution, but it was real effort and it did not go unnoticed. Samuel's eyes shone with quiet pride each time he watched his son assist him. Maya, though cautious, allowed herself to soften, her guarded distance thinning as she witnessed his gradual change. One evening, as the three of them sat together watching the sun sink into the sea, Samuel's voice broke the silence. "This is what I wanted," he whispered. "Not wealth, not power, just this: family, dignity, truth." His words hung in the air, and for once Dorian did not flinch. He reached across, placing his hand gently over his father's. Maya's gaze lingered on him, and in that moment she saw not the billionaire who had stormed into the estate with accusations, but a man struggling, imperfectly, stubbornly, to become something better. Redemption was not complete, nor was it easy. Dorian still carried arrogance, still faltered in moments when old habits clawed at him, but he was trying, and that effort began to weave threads of change through the fabric of the Kane estate. And as the days passed, he realized something profound. The wealth he had spent his life amassing was insignificant compared to the wealth of trust, forgiveness, and connection he was only now beginning to rebuild. For the first time in years, Dorian Kane felt the stirrings of peace. The father's voice. The days following Dorian's explosive return were cloaked in tension. The estate, once a place of quiet if not peace, now thrummed with a nervous energy. Servants moved like shadows, careful not to attract attention, careful not to give Dorian Kane the impression of disobedience. Yet whispers persisted, carried down corridors and across the kitchens as though the very walls themselves gossiped about the storm that had entered their halls. And at the center of it all was Samuel Kane, frail and aged, but carrying within him a weight of wisdom and regret that years of silence had only sharpened. In the mornings, Samuel would insist on being wheeled to the veranda that overlooked the sea. The crashing waves brought him solace, reminding him that even in the face of relentless storms, there was rhythm, there was continuity, there was endurance. Maya was always the one who brought him there. Despite Dorian's bitter protests that her presence was unwanted, she had tried to withdraw after the confrontation, to keep her distance so as not to ignite further suspicion. But Samuel's voice, gentle yet firm, had cut through her hesitation. "Stay. I want you here." And so she stayed, not out of defiance but out of duty, because she understood that sometimes strength was not in leaving, but in standing steadfast. Dorian did not take kindly to it. Each time he found her at his father's side, his jaw tightened, his glare seared into her like a branding iron. He said little, but the silence between them was loud enough to echo through every room. His suspicion lingered, heavy and poisonous, yet there was something else beneath it now. Something unsettled, uncertain, though he would never admit it aloud. One morning, as Samuel sat on the veranda with a blanket draped over his legs, Dorian stormed out to find Maya adjusting the pillow behind his father's back. His eyes narrowed immediately. "Again," Dorian said, his voice low but sharp. "Always hovering, always here. Do you have nothing better to do than cling to him?" Maya straightened slowly, her expression calm though her chest tightened. Before she could respond, Samuel raised a trembling hand, his voice rasping yet carrying a surprising firmness. "Enough, Dorian." The words hung in the air like a hammer striking stone. Dorian blinked, startled, for it had been a long time since his father had spoken to him with such force. Samuel's eyes, though sunken with age, burned with a light that had not dimmed. "Father," Dorian began, But Samuel cut him off. No, you will listen. His voice trembled under the strain, but his determination lent it strength. For days now I have watched you hurl accusations like daggers, watched you twist loyalty into betrayal, watched you treat kindness as corruption. And I will not remain silent. The silence that followed was thick. The wind whipped across the cliffs, carrying away the gulls' cries, leaving only the pounding of the sea. Maya bowed her head respectfully, stepping back to give father and son the space to speak, though her presence was still very much a part of the moment. Samuel drew a shaky breath. Do you know what weakness truly is, Dorian? It is not age. It is not illness. It is not needing the help of another to stand. Weakness is arrogance. Weakness is believing yourself above the truth simply because you have wealth or power, or a loud enough voice to silence others. That is weakness. Dorian stiffened, his pride bristling at the rebuke. He opened his mouth to argue, but Samuel's hand struck the armrest of his chair, the sharp sound startling in its ferocity. You returned to this house not out of love, not out of respect, but out of some twisted sense of obligation, or worse, suspicion. You saw one moment, one act of care, and you turned it into poison. You accused the very person who has stood by me when no one else would. You pushed her. You shamed her. And you did it all because you refused to see what was truly before your eyes. Dorian's throat tightened. He had faced rivals in boardrooms, lawyers in courtrooms, and politicians in negotiations, but none of them had shaken him the way his father's words did now. He hated the way his chest ached, hated the way guilt clawed at him even as pride fought to smother it. She is a maid, he said finally, his voice quieter than he intended. You expect me to believe she acts out of kindness alone? That there is no ulterior motive? Samuel's lips curled into a bitter smile. And what do you act out of, Dorian? Is there no ulterior motive behind your wealth? Your empire? Do you not seek power, influence, control? We are all driven by something. But motives are revealed not in words but in actions, and her actions have spoken louder than anything you accuse her of. Maya's eyes stung, though she willed the tears not to fall. Samuel's defense was not just for her. It was a voice she had longed for in countless moments of her life when others had silenced or dismissed her. To be seen, to be acknowledged, was a gift she had not expected. Dorian turned away, pacing to the edge of the veranda, his hands gripping the railing. The sea roared below, endless and untamed, a mirror of the storm inside him. He wanted to argue, to insist he was right, but the cracks in his certainty grew wider with each word his father spoke. Samuel's voice softened now, though its weight remained. I am not blind, Dorian. I know my time is short. I called you here because I wanted to see you before the end. Not the man you show the world, but the son I raised. The boy who once believed in honor, who once understood that loyalty is not a weakness but a strength. Where has he gone? The question cut deeper than any accusation. Dorian felt his chest constrict, memories flooding unbidden, his father teaching him to ride a horse, his mother's laughter echoing through the halls. The warmth of family dinners before ambition had pulled him away. He clenched his jaw, forcing the memories back into the vault where he had long kept them. I am who I need to be, he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Samuel closed his eyes, weary but unrelenting. Then perhaps you need to remember who you were meant to be. The veranda fell silent save for the relentless pounding of the waves. Dorian remained with his back turned, his pride waging war against the stirrings of doubt and guilt. Maya stood quietly at Samuel's side, her presence steady, her heart heavy with the weight of the confrontation. At length Samuel's voice returned, softer now, almost a whisper. Maya, will you take me inside? I've said enough for today. Yes, sir, she said gently, moving to wheel him back into the house. Dorian remained frozen at the railing, staring out at the endless horizon as though it held answers he could not yet grasp. That night, Samuel lay awake, his body frail, but his spirit alight. He had spoken, and though his words had not shattered Dorian's walls, he had seen the cracks appear. He prayed they would widen, that time would allow his son to rediscover the humanity buried beneath ambition. Maya sat by his bedside, quietly reading aloud from one of his favorite books. Her voice was soft, steady, carrying him through the night. And as Samuel drifted between wakefulness and sleep, he thought of legacy, not of wealth or property, but of values, of the truths that outlasted gold. For the first time in many years, He allowed himself to hope. The maid's truth morning light broke across the Kane estate like a hesitant hand peeling away the night. The sea glimmered in shades of steel and sapphire, gulls wheeling in the distance as if they carried messages from another world. Inside the house, however, the mood was anything but bright. The echoes of the previous evening's accusations still clung to the walls like stubborn cobwebs. Servants moved quietly through the halls, their conversations hushed, their eyes darting nervously whenever Dorian's shadow appeared. The storm that had erupted had not passed. It had only settled into a tense silence that threatened to shatter at any moment. Maya rose early, as she always did, her body moving with practiced efficiency despite the ache in her arm where the skin still bore the sting of Dorian's shove. She washed the wound herself, binding it with a strip of linen she had torn from an old apron. She did not ask for help, nor did she expect it. Her life had taught her long ago that when you fell, you picked yourself up alone. That truth, though hard, had become her strength. As she stood before the small mirror fixed above her dresser, she studied the face staring back at her. Wide, dark eyes framed by lashes that seemed too heavy for a servant's life. Skin kissed by the sun of childhood summers long gone. Lips pressed together in a firm line that refused to tremble. To many, she was invisible. A maid, a pair of hands meant for cleaning and serving, nothing more. But the eyes in the mirror reminded her she was more than what this house chose to see. Her mind drifted back to the years before she had stepped foot into the Kane household, years that lived beneath her skin like scars etched in invisible ink. She had grown up in a small coastal town where the air smelled of brine and fish, where her father worked the docks and her mother kept a modest home with pride. They had not been wealthy, but they had been rich in laughter, in music, in the small joys of togetherness. That world had been shattered when her father was crushed in an accident unloading cargo. Overnight, her mother was left with 3 children to feed and no savings to cling to. Maya, the eldest, had been only 16. She left school without hesitation, taking on work wherever she could find it, scrubbing floors, laundering clothes, waiting tables until her hands cracked from detergent and her back screamed with exhaustion. She did not complain. She simply endured because the alternative was hunger and despair for her siblings. When her mother's health began to fail, the weight grew heavier. Bills piled up like stones on her shoulders. And when the chance came to work in a wealthy household far from home, she seized it. She promised her siblings she would send money every month, that she would carry the burden so they could continue their studies. They cried when she left, but she had smiled, even as her heart broke because she knew sacrifice was love made visible. The Kane estate had been just another house to clean when she first arrived, but over time it became a test of her strength in ways she never imagined. Samuel Kane, already weakened by illness, had seen her not as a servant but as a human being. He had spoken to her, asked about her day, thanked her when she helped him even in small things. In his weary eyes she had glimpsed echoes of her own father, proud, stubborn, unwilling to surrender to frailty. And in caring for him she found not only duty but also a quiet honor. That was the truth. Not the twisted picture painted by Dorian's suspicion, not the venom whispered by staff too eager for scandal. The truth was that Maya had given pieces of herself to help Samuel Kane fight for dignity in the face of decline. As she tied her apron and stepped into the corridor, she repeated that truth to herself like a prayer. It was her shield against the glances that followed her, against the murmurs that rose like smoke whenever she passed. Dorian, meanwhile, had spent the night in restless silence. Whiskey had dulled his anger but not his unease, and when dawn touched the horizon he found himself walking the halls of his childhood home with an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. Every corner whispered of memories he had long buried. The grand staircase where his father once stood tall and commanding, the library where his mother read aloud in the evenings, the garden where he and his siblings had played hide-and-seek. Each memory carried with it the echo of what had been lost: warmth, laughter, and a sense of belonging. He entered the dining hall, expecting silence, but found Maya already there, arranging breakfast trays for the staff. She moved with quiet grace, her hair pulled back neatly, her hand steady despite the bandage visible on her arm. When she sensed his presence, she stiffened but did not turn. Dorian's jaw tightened. He had given her until sunset to leave, yet here she was, still in his house, as though his command meant nothing. He opened his mouth to speak, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the steadiness of her movements, the way she carried herself without fear or apology. Or perhaps it was the echo of Harris's words from the night before. Perhaps you see what you expect to see, not what is truly there. Why are you still here? His voice was low, cold, but less explosive than before. Maya turned slowly, her eyes meeting his without wavering. Because your father needs me. The bluntness of her reply startled him. Most people cowered before his gaze, stumbled over their words, eager to appease his authority. But this woman, a maid with no wealth, no power, no status, stood before him with a composure that bordered on defiance. My father has nurses, he said sharply. Doctors. He doesn't need you. Doctors treat his body, she replied calmly. Nurses follow their orders, but neither of them stay when the nights are long and he cannot sleep, when he wants to walk even though his legs betray him, when he wants someone to talk to about things that have nothing to do with illness. That is what I give him. That is what you mistook for something shameful. Her words struck like arrows. For a moment, Dorian faltered, his carefully constructed armor cracking. He masked it quickly, narrowing his eyes. You speak boldly for someone of your station. And you accuse boldly for someone who does not know the whole story, Maya answered. Her tone was not insolent, it was steady, almost weary, as though she had endured enough injustice in life to no longer tremble before it. The silence between them stretched. Dorian studied her, searching for cracks, for signs of deceit. But all he found was a quiet conviction that unnerved him more than any protest or denial could. Finally, he muttered, You will leave. One way or another. He turned on his heel and strode out, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. Maya exhaled slowly once he was gone. She knew he did not believe her yet. Perhaps he never would. But the truth did not vanish simply because someone refused to see it. Later that day, Samuel Kane requested to see her. Harris delivered the message with a sympathetic look, guiding her to the east wing. She entered the room quietly, finding Samuel propped up against pillows, his face pale but his eyes alert. Maya, he whispered, his voice thin but determined. Come closer. She approached, pulling a chair beside his bed. I tried to speak yesterday, he said, his hand trembling as he lifted it weakly. But my strength failed me. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to defend you. But the words, his eyes clouded with regret. You don't have to explain, she said softly, taking his hand in both of hers. I know who you are. That is enough. Tears glistened in the corners of his eyes. You have given me back pieces of life I thought I had lost. You make me feel human again, not just an old man waiting to die. And now, because of me, you have been shamed. Do not blame yourself, Maya replied firmly. Your son sees through eyes clouded by suspicion. That is not your fault. It is his burden to bear, not yours. Samuel closed his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You speak with wisdom far beyond your years. You remind me of someone. Your father, perhaps? Her chest tightened. She had never spoken much of her past to Samuel, yet somehow he sensed the echoes of it in her. She nodded faintly. He taught me that dignity is not about wealth or power. It is about how you rise when life tries to break you. Wise man, Samuel murmured. I wish Dorian could see as you do. Maya hesitated, then asked, Why is he so filled with anger? Samuel's expression darkened. Because he left this house long ago, chasing wealth and power, and in the process he lost something far more valuable. He does not see it yet, but one day he will. At least I pray he will. Maya sat in silence beside him, her hand still holding his frail fingers. She did not know what storms lay ahead, but she knew one thing with certainty. The truth had a way of enduring. And no accusation, no matter how venomous, could erase it forever. The legacy. The sea beyond the Kane estate was restless that morning, its waves rolling against the cliffs as though the earth itself was exhaling. The gulls cried overhead, their voices sharp in the dawn, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and change. Inside the mansion, silence reigned. Not the tense silence of suspicion or pride, but the hushed reverence of a house holding its breath. For everyone who worked there sensed, though none dared speak it aloud, that Samuel Kane's time was nearing its end. He had grown weaker in recent days, his steps fewer, his sleep heavier, his voice fading into whispers, yet his eyes remained sharp, clear with a wisdom that seemed to expand as his body dwindled. He had lived long enough to see wealth accumulate and scatter, to witness sons stray and return, to taste both triumph and regret. And in these final days he seemed to carry within him an urgency, not of fear but of purpose. There were words still to be spoken, truth still to be passed on, and wounds still to be healed. Dorian sat at his father's bedside that morning, not in command or judgment, but in quiet presence. Gone was the billionaire who thundered accusations and demanded obedience. In his place sat a man stripped of arrogance, humbled by the weight of his father's frailty and the mirror it had forced him to face. He had learned, slowly and painfully, that power did not lie in dominance but in understanding, in connection, in humility. The man who once believed wealth was the measure of all things now found himself clinging to moments that no fortune could buy: the squeeze of his father's hand, the faint smile that lit his face when Maya entered the room, the silence shared without words. Maya herself moved like a steady flame through the household, her presence unwavering. She tended to Samuel with the same patience she always had, but now there was a quiet respect in the way others watched her. Even the servants who once whispered suspicions about her seemed to bow their heads when she passed, as though recognizing what they had overlooked for so long. She was not merely a maid. She had become the heart of the house, the keeper of its dignity when pride had sought to tarnish it. That morning, Samuel called for both of them. His voice was barely more than a breath, but it carried the authority of a man who had led armies of men, who had built empires, who had raised sons. "Dorian." "Maya," he whispered, his eyes flickering between them. "Sit with me," they did. Maya on his right, Dorian on his left, both leaning close to hear the words of a man who had so little breath left, but so much still to say. "I have lived a long life," Samuel began, pausing to gather strength. "I have seen what money can build, and I have seen what pride can destroy. I built this estate with my hands, with my mind, with sacrifices both noble and foolish. But wealth, I have learned, is not measured in gold or land or titles. It is measured in the love we give, in the dignity we preserve, in the legacy we leave in the hearts of those who outlive us." His gaze turned to Dorian, piercing even through the haze of age. "You left, my son, because you thought wealth would fill the emptiness. You believed power could silence the ache. And in chasing it, you forgot the truth I once tried to teach you, that no empire stands without loyalty and no man stands without compassion. You became rich, yes, but you became poor in the ways that matter most." Dorian's throat tightened. He bowed his head, tears burning at the corners of his eyes, though he tried to hide them. "I know, Father. I see it now. And I would give it all back if I could undo the pain I caused." Samuel's trembling hand reached out and Dorian clasped it tightly, feeling the frailty of bones beneath skin. "Regret is heavy, my son, but redemption is always possible, if you choose it every day, not in grand gestures, but in small acts. It is not enough to see the truth. You must live it." Then Samuel turned to Maya, his eyes softening. "And you have been my strength when my own failed. You gave me dignity when illness sought to strip it away. You reminded me in my final years that kindness is the greatest wealth of all. For that I am indebted to you more than words can say." Maya's eyes filled with tears, though her voice was steady. "You owe me nothing, sir. It was an honor to walk beside you." Samuel smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but I would have you walk beside my son too. Not as a servant, but as a voice of truth he must never forget. He needs you, though his pride may deny it. And I pray you will not turn away." Maya glanced at Dorian, whose eyes widened slightly at his father's words. She said nothing, but the silence between them was not rejection. It was possibility, fragile and unspoken. Samuel's breathing grew shallow then, his strength waning. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them once more, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the window where the sea met the sky. "When I am gone, remember this. Wealth fades, power crumbles, even names are forgotten. But the way you treat others, the dignity you grant them, that is the legacy that endures." His final words lingered in the air, a benediction over both of them. Then, with a sigh that seemed to carry both surrender and peace, Samuel Kane closed his eyes for the last time. The house mourned. The servants wept. The halls echoed with silence deeper than ever before, and the sea itself seemed to roar with sorrow. Samuel Kane, patriarch of the estate, was gone, but his words, his lessons, his legacy remained etched in the hearts of those who had sat at his side. For Dorian, grief was heavy, but it was not hollow. He had lost his father, yes, but he had gained something he thought impossible: clarity, humility, a chance at redemption. He no longer measured himself by the empires he built, but by the bridges he had begun to rebuild. He did not leave the estate after the funeral. Instead, he stayed, walking its halls not as a ruler but as a son reclaiming a home. He spoke with the staff, not as subordinates but as people. He learned their names, their stories, their struggles. Slowly, the coldness that had defined him began to thaw. Maya remained too, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because Samuel's final request had rooted itself in her heart. She continued her work, but her role had shifted. She was no longer just the caretaker of a frail old man. She became a companion in Dorian's journey, a reminder of the truths his father had entrusted to them both. Their relationship was not immediate trust or affection. It was cautious, tentative, marked by the memory of accusations and wounds, but beneath it was the seed of something enduring: respect. And respect, they both knew, was the soil from which all true legacies grew. Months passed and the estate changed. Gardens once neglected bloomed again, not under the hands of hired landscapers, but because Dorian himself spent mornings there, remembering how his father loved the sea breeze. The servants spoke of how the house felt lighter, how the fear that once lingered in the air had been replaced by something gentler, and at the heart of it all was the echo of Samuel's voice, a father's final lesson, a legacy carried not in gold or land but in the lives of those who remained. In the end, the story of the Kane family was not about a billionaire's wealth, nor a maid's humble station, nor even the clash of pride and suspicion. It was about truth, dignity, and the redemption that can be found when hearts are willing to listen. Samuel Kane had left this world, but he had left behind something far greater than riches. He had left behind a son transformed, a woman honored, and a household forever changed by the simple, eternal truth. The accusation, the silence that followed Dorian's command to have Maya removed, felt like a suffocating shroud over the parlor. The servants scattered uneasily, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. The echoes of Dorian's fury still clung to the walls, mingling with the scent of medicine and sandalwood. Samuel Kane sat slumped in his wheelchair, his thin hands trembling over the armrests, his eyes wide with both exhaustion and despair. He wanted to call out, to correct the terrible misjudgment that had just been cast like a curse over the room. But his voice had been stolen by weakness and age. Maya stood where she had been shoved, her back straight despite the blood trickling down her arm, her chin slightly lifted as though bracing herself against invisible winds. There was no apology in her eyes, no pleading for understanding. There was only the steady, silent fire of someone who had been wrongly accused and refused to bend beneath the weight of it. She caught Harris's uneasy glance. The butler had served the Kane family for nearly 40 years, and though his loyalty bound him to Dorian's orders, his eyes betrayed regret. Dorian turned on her one last time, his face carved from stone. "Pack your things and be gone before sunset. If I see you on this property after tonight, you'll regret it." His words were not shouted this time, but spoken in a low, cold tone that carried far more threat than his earlier roar. He adjusted his cufflinks with sharp, mechanical movements, then brushed past her as though she were an object, not a person. His footsteps thundered down the corridor, echoing until they faded into the distance. The remaining staff shifted uneasily, no one daring to move or speak. Finally, Harris stepped forward, his voice heavy with duty. "Miss Maya, perhaps it is best if you—" "I heard him," she cut in, her voice steady but hoarse. She turned her gaze toward Samuel, whose lips trembled as he tried to form words. The sight softened her expression. For weeks she had been the one to lift him from his bed, coax him to take a few steps, wipe the sweat from his brow, and steady him when his legs faltered. She had been his silent witness in moments of vulnerability no one else cared to see. And now to have that twisted into something vile, it stung her pride, yes, but it wounded her spirit even more. Kneeling by Samuel's side, she whispered softly, "Don't worry, sir. I know the truth. You don't have to explain." Her hand brushed lightly against his, not as a plea for comfort, but as a reassurance for him. He tried to grip her fingers, but his strength failed. Still, the faint twitch of his hand spoke volumes. "I'll go," she continued, rising to her feet with quiet dignity, "but not because of his threats. I'll go because this house has forgotten the meaning of trust, and I will not stay where I am viewed as a vulture circling prey." Her words carried farther than she intended, bouncing off the high ceilings, seeping into the ears of the servants who lingered by the door. Some lowered their eyes ashamed. Others stiffened, uncomfortable with the truth laid bare. Harris bowed his head, a sigh trembling from his lips. Without another glance, Maya left the parlor, her steps slow but deliberate, her figure a mixture of wounded grace and unyielding resolve. Dorian retreated to his father's study, slamming the heavy door behind him. The room smelled faintly of old books, leather, and the faint musk of cigars long since extinguished. He paced before the tall windows, his reflection fractured by the evening light. His blood still burned from what he had witnessed, the image of Maya holding his father seared into his mind. He could not banish the thought that she had been plotting, manipulating, wrapping herself around the old man with the skill of someone who knew exactly how to prey on weakness. Yet, beneath the layers of rage, another voice whispered, a quieter, more unsettling one. What if you were wrong? He shook it off violently. His life had taught him that naivety was weakness, that those who entered your home with kind faces often left with your wealth and trust stolen. He had built an empire on suspicion, on anticipating betrayal before it struck. And now, seeing that maid clinging to his father, it was too easy to believe. Still, he could not ignore the look in her eyes. Not pleading, not guilt, something else entirely. A knock broke his spiraling thoughts. Harris entered quietly, closing the door behind him. "Sir," he said, bowing slightly. "What is it now?" Dorian snapped, though his voice lacked the thunder it carried earlier. "I thought it my duty to inform you Miss Maya has been serving your father faithfully for more than a year. In fact, since his condition worsened, she has been his most constant caretaker. Many of the staff have come and gone, but she has remained." Harris's voice was measured, respectful, but there was steel beneath it. Dorian narrowed his eyes. "Are you suggesting I misjudged what I saw?" "I am not so bold, sir," Harris replied carefully, though the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed his true feelings. "But I will say this, Mr. Samuel trusted her. He trusted her more than any of us. You may think of her as merely a maid, but to him she was a companion through his most difficult hours." Dorian's hands tightened into fists. "Companion? Don't dress it up, Harris. I know manipulation when I see it. Perhaps," the butler said softly, "or perhaps you see what you expect to see, not what is truly there." The word stung, though Dorian would never admit it. He waved Harris away, muttering, "That will be all." When the butler left, silence reclaimed the room. Dorian poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling like molten fire. He downed it in one swallow, hoping it would burn away the unease creeping into his chest. Meanwhile, Maya sat in her small room in the servants' quarters, the modest space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a wooden dresser, and a single chair. The window overlooked the sea, its waves crashing relentlessly against the cliffs, echoing the storm within her. She pressed a cloth to her bleeding arm, hissing softly as the sting reminded her of Dorian's shove. Her eyes drifted to the small stack of letters tucked in the corner of her dresser. Unopened, untouched. They were hers, written late at night, addressed to no one in particular. They told the story of why she was here, of what she had endured before stepping into the Kane household. They held the truth she had never spoken aloud. She thought of Samuel, his frail body collapsing against her, his whispered plea to try once more. She thought of how his eyes had brightened just slightly each time he managed to take even the smallest step. For him, it wasn't about walking again. It was about dignity, about reclaiming slivers of life in a body that betrayed him daily. And she had been honored to help him fight for those moments. Now all of that had been twisted into filth. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. She could leave. She could walk out tonight and never look back. The world outside was cruel, yes, but it was free of accusations. Yet something tethered her here. Something deeper than obligation. She wasn't ready to leave Samuel alone, not like this. Not under the shadow of his son's mistrust. Her decision crystallized with a calm finality. She would endure. She would stand firm. And if Dorian Kane wanted to see her as a vulture, then she would let time prove the truth he refused to see. As night fell over the estate, Samuel Kane lay awake in his room. The darkness pressed heavily against the windows, broken only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. His breath rattled in his chest, each inhale a labor, each exhale a surrender. His mind replayed the scene again and again. Dorian's fury, Maya's fall, the whispers of the staff. He had wanted to shout, to defend her, to remind his son of the values he had once tried to instill in him. But his voice had betrayed him, weak and powerless. A tear slipped from the corner of his eye. He thought of his late wife, of how she would have scolded Dorian for his arrogance, how she would have protected Maya with the ferocity of a lioness. Samuel's chest ached with longing. "Forgive him," he whispered into the night, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Maya, to God, or to his wife beyond the grave. He knows not what he does. But deep down, Samuel knew this was only the beginning of a storm that would shake the Kane household to its core. The return. The wind howled across the iron gates of the Kane estate, carrying with it a mixture of salt from the nearby sea and the brittle scent of old leaves. The estate had stood for over a century, perched on the edge of cliffs like a brooding sentinel. Its windows glimmered faintly in the late afternoon sun, shadows stretching across manicured gardens that once boasted roses, but now showed signs of neglect. The house, though grand, seemed weary, as though it mirrored the frailty of the man who owned it. Dorian Kane stepped out of the sleek black car with the precision of someone who hadn't been home in years and wasn't sure whether he wanted to be there. His tailored suit looked almost out of place against the backdrop of stone walls and ivy, like a piece of Wall Street that had wandered into an ancestral fortress. His sunglasses reflected the looming facade, but his jaw tightened beneath them. For years, he had been away, building empires in foreign cities, stacking boardrooms with power, and filling headlines with acquisitions and mergers. Dorian Kane was a man who understood numbers, strategy, and control. But when it came to family, he had walked away long ago, believing the past was too heavy to carry. He hadn't planned to return. Not like this. But the letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier. A trembling hand had signed it. Samuel Kane, his father. The man who had once been a towering figure of authority in Dorian's life, reduced now to begging his son to come home. The words were brief, shaky, and more powerful than any boardroom ultimatum. "I don't have much time. Come if you still care." Those words had dug beneath his armor, and though Dorian told himself he was coming out of duty, perhaps even guilt somewhere deep within, the child who once admired his father demanded he come. As he strode through the gates, the old butler, Mr. Harris, appeared. His back was bent, but his uniform immaculate. His eyes widened slightly when they fell upon Dorian as though a ghost had returned. "Mr. Kane," Harris said, his voice a mixture of relief and apprehension. "We didn't expect you until tomorrow." "I didn't expect myself either," Dorian replied curtly, removing his sunglasses. His eyes were cold steel, betraying little emotion. "Where is he?" "In the East Wing, sir, resting, though." Harris hesitated, then continued. "Miss Maya is with him." Dorian frowned. "Who?" "The maid, sir. She's been here for some time, taking care of your father." Something sharp flickered in Dorian's chest, though he wasn't sure if it was irritation or curiosity. He nodded once and brushed past the butler, his polished shoes echoing across marble floors. The grand parlor smelled faintly of sandalwood and medicine. Heavy drapes softened the sunlight, and the antique furniture seemed as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Dorian pushed the doors open, and the sight before him made the blood in his veins ignite like fire. There, in the center of the room, was his father, frail, pale, his thin frame barely supported as he tried to stand. Beside him, a young woman in a simple maid's uniform wrapped her arms around him, holding him steady. Her brow glistened with sweat as though she had been straining herself. His father's head lolled against her shoulder, dangerously close to her chest. Their bodies pressed together in a way that made Dorian's mind leap to the worst conclusion. The room froze. "What the hell are you doing with my father?" Dorian's voice thundered through the chamber like an earthquake. The doors slammed shut behind him with the force of his entrance. The woman, Maya, flinched, her eyes wide. She instinctively tightened her hold on Samuel Kane as though protecting him. "Have you no shame?" Dorian roared, his steps quick and predatory as he advanced. Maya's lips parted, panic flickering in her gaze. "Please, it's not what it looks like. He just wanted to try standing today. His therapy was—" But Dorian cut her off with a snarl. "Therapy? Is that what you call this? Grinding against a helpless old man? You filthy little snake." His words dripped with venom, each syllable sharpened by years of distrust and arrogance. Samuel Kane tried to speak, but his voice was weak, drowned out by his son's fury. "Dorian, stop!" But Dorian was blind to reason. "You think just because he's weak, he's easy prey? You think you can worm your way into his life, into this house, and then what? Into his will? Maya lowered Samuel gently into his wheelchair, her hands trembling but controlled. Mr. Kane, I swear, don't you dare lie to me. Dorian's face was red with rage, veins throbbing at his temples. I walk in and find the housemaid crawling all over my father. Disgusting. The staff had gathered now. The butler, Marcia the cook, 2 junior maids, even a gardener who had wandered in from the hall. Their gasps filled the air, whispers igniting like wildfire. I saw it, one maid whispered. She was always alone with him, another muttered. God knows what else she's done, came a hushed voice from the cook. The air thickened with suspicion and judgment. Dorian's fury boiled over. He reached forward and shoved Maya. She stumbled, hitting the leg of a table with a sharp crack. Pain shot through her elbow and a thin line of blood bloomed across her forearm. Gasps erupted louder this time. Shock painted the faces of those who watched. But no one moved. The mighty billionaire had returned and his word was law. Maya sat up slowly, shaking, her cheeks flushed. Not from shame, but from fury. She clenched her fists but held her tongue. Not one of these people knew what had happened mere minutes earlier. Not one of them saw Samuel Kane struggling to take a few precious steps, whispering, "Just for me, Maya, please. Just a few more steps." All they saw was the scandal Dorian believed, and as Maya met Dorian's blazing eyes, a silent vow formed within her. She would not be broken by his accusations. She would not allow herself to be erased by his arrogance. She knew the truth, and the truth had a way of shining through even in the darkest of storms. Dorian's chest heaved as silence blanketed the room. His father sat trembling in his wheelchair, his hand gripping the armrest, his eyes pleading. "Dorian," Samuel whispered again, weaker this time. "She wasn't—" But Dorian turned on his heel, his fury drowning out the frail voice. "Harris, remove her from this house immediately. I'll not have vipers under my roof." The butler's mouth opened, then closed. His eyes darted to Maya, then to Samuel, then back to Dorian. But duty chained him and he bowed his head. "Yes, sir." Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her heart thundered, but she rose to her feet, blood still dripping down her arm. She wanted to scream, to shout the truth into the air until it shattered every false whisper. But she looked at Samuel Kane's weary face, saw the pain in his eyes, and swallowed her words. For now, because she knew this was not the end. It was only the beginning.